So the next speaker is Justin Borevitz. Justin grew up on an experimental farm in California. He's undergrad at UC in Wollongong, and he did his PhD postdoc at UC San Diego Salk. He was a professor at the University of Chicago, and he's been with the ANU since 2012, where he's researching landscape regeneration technologies for food ecosystem and climate security. Justin.
Yep, I think so. Thanks so much. Okay, so I hope to give you guys a little more optimistic outlook on what could be done if we did take this seriously and act. And I believe we are in a good place in Australia to deploy some large-scale regeneration approaches at speed. And it's going to integrate several different technologies that are shown here on this cartoon. Basically, grass and trees for photosynthesis, for carbon capture, sequestration in soils, and other approaches that can lead to more permanent carbon drawdown. So, let me see. Big green arrow. All right. It takes people coming together, talking, and that's what we're doing today. Just to recap a little, Mark talked about negative emissions, and I think that's a real potential for landscapes. But the obvious things right in front is to shift from fossil fuels to renewables and efficiency. We're seeing, great accelerations in battery technology and electric cars. We don't hear enough about heat pumps and electrification moving off of gas, but we need to do that as well. And there are a lot of solutions for our industries. In Australia, once we have abundant renewable resources, and Australia is really the place to lead on that. But that's just to reduce emissions, which is the first step. To actually go beyond and go below, we need to convert agriculture, both the direct emissions and indirect emissions from land use change and expansion, into part of the solution. So where energy is reducing the bad, agriculture can do a flip and go from being part of the problem to part of the solution. We already need to acknowledge and appreciate that both the oceans and the land are cleaning up about a quarter of our emissions currently, and we can't continue to take that for granted, but we can deploy these natural climate solutions and learn from nature. Now, the scale of the biological carbon cycle, I think, is underappreciated. The photosynthesis is about an order of magnitude larger than our annual emissions, but this is also part of the natural cycle. And so it's finely balanced that carbon that draws down on the order of about 7 parts per million each year goes back mostly as the leaves, plants need energy to live as well, and they make it. So the autotrophic respiration is a release of about 60 gigatons of pure carbon per year, and then heterotrophic respiration when leaves drop on the ground. And the roots obviously also need energy, and the microbes and the soils and everything we heard about Charlie Massey. That's part of the natural carbon cycle. So if we can increase the gains a little bit, and agriculture has been, the first green revolution, we can add water and nutrients and boost the productivity, but we need to also reduce the losses. And Wolfram talked about biochar yesterday, and he mentioned enhanced rock weathering. These are ways of reducing the losses. So just a small shift in addition to complete energy transformation can ultimately get us to negative emissions. And that's what I want to talk about today. So again, it's both a game of reductions, mostly in cities and industry, but also removals. And this is for the next stage. And to go below zero, we need to remove. It's not an offset of current emissions, but it's really the only way to pull back yesterday's emissions. And that's where we want to deploy. The two main solutions in the IPCC reports are agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And this potential bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But if we can integrate both of these together, what I call precision regeneration, there is a potential, I think, if we deploy it at scale globally, to get on the order of 10 gigatons of CO2 drawdown per year, maybe sustain that for 50 years. So this is not going to allow us to keep burning by any means, but it can be a big part of this enduring solution and to reduce those risks of cascading tipping points that we heard about. So that's removals. Now, we often think about it's either farm or fail, that this is agricultural land. We need to be as productive as possible. If we don't produce food, we're going to lead to starvation. But if we're not doing that sustainably, or we're already just marginal yields to begin with, then it's a matter of failure ultimately, and there'll be starvation tomorrow, if not today. So this really is a false choice, and I want to lay out alternative scenarios for both agriculture and ecosystems, which is an active process of regeneration and restoration together. That the best way to improve yields may be to stop farming the poor productive areas and restore those so that we can have the water holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity, and a buffer for our productive zones. So this is not going to happen overnight. It's not like we just turn on the machines and fire it up and then we start drawing down CO2. We can plant a seed. It takes time to grow. We need to get through droughts, fires, and floods. And the sooner we start, the better. We're not going to be perfect. We need to learn by doing. And the scale of this is really massive regeneration. It's tens of millions of hectares per year in Australia. We do have the land, we have the potential, and lots of co-benefits will come with this. It's going to need mobilization, investment, and coordination. And it's really a continental approach that starts with individual farms and redesign at higher resolution. And that's what I'd like to tell you about today. Now, the government has been listening, about the potential of what agriculture can do, especially soils. And we think at Soils for Life, when the former General Michael Jeffries, last time we were on this stage together, was about measurement of soil carbon, cheaply, broad scale, accurate, and there's funding available to do that. Now, how could it be done? Can it be done? We're not going to probably take even 1 million soil cores per year around this country, but we can learn a lot by improved measurement, and we need to be accurate about what is potential. And I'll talk a little bit about new tools for, separating baseline soil organic carbon from particulate organic carbon, and what is cycling and what is more stable. We also need to measure the environmental inputs at higher resolution. We know that it's a dynamic process, high variability in rainfall. But measurement alone is not enough, and we need modeling. We need new tools. We heard about the fantastic soil regenerative processes. Those generally are not in the current agricultural models. We need to figure out how we can build soils as well as above ground yield. And we have fantastic tools to monitor the progress at scale from satellites and drones, and I'll show a little bit about how we can link those. But the real fundamental shift is the management. And what are these regenerative solutions? We need to measure response to the management change, not just response to wet years versus dry years. What are those tools? And we know that Charlie laid it out yesterday, the design principles, changing the real estate between your ears to contrast the conventional methods of business as usual, or stepping back, that farm or fail. Those are the alternative controls. We'd like to implement solutions such as rehydration, rotational grazing, cover cropping, agroforestry, and other approaches. So we really need to connect all of this together. It's not just one tool at one dimension, but putting all these pieces together. And so some of the features in the next generation modeling is to separate the small water cycle that we heard about from the larger kind of blue or green water cycle. We need to think about that opportunity of growing and managing the invisible gas of water vapor. And when it goes out of a leaf, that's an opportunity to capture carbon. That's when photosynthesis happens, the gas exchange water out and carbon in, just evaporation from ponds or rivers or small rainfall into sand. There's no opportunity to capture carbon. So the big shift is shifting evaporation to transpiration. And that's often called evapotranspiration and not separated. The other one we heard about, I think, is really key, and we need to measure and model accurately, is soil infiltration. How do we get that water into the ground and over-tilling? And so this is really the opportunity. If the water gets into the ground, the roots can take it up, and that can prime this pump. Some water obviously will go out and still feed the rivers, but that can be slower, and that's percolation through the bottom. Below ground has been the black box for all of us in plant science. We don't have the equivalent phenotyping to how big the roots are and how much carbon is in soil. That's been a hard problem, but if we can do targeted measurements in these alternative management approaches, we can really bring the science to prove, like, what is the root area index? We think about shoot area index. These are features that can be measured and can be included in a model and could be bred and improved our varieties. Now, similar things are happening in the carbon cycle. If we can be explicit about this, a leaf, falls on the ground. Is that soil carbon that can offset coal or gas? Not at all. That certainly has very important soil health properties. We need the nutrient cycling, but that's not stable carbon. We can think about CO2 converted to the living two-dimensional surface areas of leaves and roots that do the cycling, but the storage then is the volume of a stem, or the aggregate carbon that we heard about in holistic management systems. That's probably tough as wood as well. It's kind of decadal carbon. And then there's geological carbon, the fossil fuels, but could we shift some labile carbon into that more permanent recalcitrant approach? And Wolfram talked about that yesterday, as well as rock mineralization. So these are ways of increasing the carbon capture and improving the storage that we can put into the model. Now, just briefly, what's going on below ground? Lots of exciting new science in the microbial activity space, the biotrophic microbes that live, both fungi, as Guy Webb talked about, and also nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the rhizobacteria that we know are important. They're living off of sugars fixed out of thin air by photosynthesis, and that's translocated to the roots. A lot of that is re-released in soils, but different microbial communities may be more or less efficient at converting that. Ultimately, we'd like to shift most of that carbon cycle into the more stable components, like mineral-associated organic matter. There's really two processes of forming soils. The living soil pathway is not in most models, and that can be updated. We need to be able to measure that. And so soil fractionation is really important to distinguish the kind of floating, labile, particulate organic matter from these more recalcitrant, denser forms of stable carbon. So we need more advanced tests that fractionate soil carbon. One last technical tool that I want to highlight here, because it's something that we do well in my lab, and this is genomics for breeding, and we can breed complex traits and make predictions, but it hasn't yet really been applied at scale. And in the microbial space, this is exciting new science. And so we can really draw out DNA just as we do out of leaves to improve the seeds. We can do that to kind of improve or breed communities of microbes, at least select varieties that work well with the plants, and try to inoculate them. So this is new technology to quantify those potentially quorum sensing microbes and classify them and select them and shift the below ground communities into those pathways that we want. And it's really working with nature, observing and potentially enhancing what's going on below ground. So putting all this together, we really need these farm system design tools. I'll show you a few examples that students have developed. It's about integrating not just the monocultures of cropping, pasture, or forestry, but mixed land use. That could be the silvopasture, agroforestry, woodland restoration with limited grazing at the right time, rehydration of creek lines, ridge lines separated by some contours that slow the flow and spread the water. We can model this at high resolution with digital elevation models and topography. We know where the sun's going to go. We know the evaporative demand is going to increase. Water flows downhill. If we can get the infiltration that should be available to roots, these can be modeled really at the farm scale. And we'd like to think about these regenerative farm units. Could be a square kilometer or even a hectare level unit where we'll stop farming the sensitive ridge lines, get trees established so that infiltration can happen, take a step back from the creek lines and repair erosion gullies. This is a little cartoon of how you could make these integrated forest farms for protection. It's shelter belts, woodlots, conservation zones, and maintaining some protected grazing and cropping systems. You can link these together into landscapes. And recently, if you go to Civilize AI, this was a tool originally designed for the ACT government to plan their new suburbs. But you can design precision paddocks by selecting an area and fly around and design these precision paddocks. Now, I just want to show in the last few minutes, am I running low on time? 4 minutes, okay, yeah. So we'd like to take this to scale. At the continental level, I think there's on the order of 100 million hectares or 1 million precision pixels that are ripe for regeneration. It's a good round number for starting. We need to think about the intermediate scale, these agro eco-regions, if you will, like the Monero be just to the south of us is a fantastic opportunity for integrating farm forestry while protecting the agricultural system. I just want to show now how we could link that measurement, modeling, and satellite-based monitoring. There is a call, of course, the government would like to be able to accurately measure soil carbon, but that's not really the question. The question is, can we measure the change, the amount of sequestration, not the raw baseline? Just because you've measured carbon doesn't mean you've sequestered it, right? We need to know how it's improving with management in these stable fractions over time. So even if we got the soil tests down to $3, that's not going to really scale. What we need is to calibrate models based on remote sensing that can predict the change in response to management. And so that's what I'd like to show you now. Kirsty Yates, who's in the audience, has been working with a group out in the rangelands that have been doing rehydration, these contours. And so we'll show you a little bit of results from their recent studies. So this is far out west in the real marginal country, right in the heart of where rainfall variability is increasing. When they do get rains, it comes hard and fast, and then there's huge gaps in between. This is a large opportunity because the area is so big, and these community of farmers have shifted from tractors to graders, and they're recontouring and building ponds in their landscape. And so Dale Roberts on campus has looked for Geoscience Australia at the Sentinel-2 data, and that's 10 bands, not just the red, blue, and green, but all the way out into the infrared. And if you just look at this landscape, it's pretty harsh, and for the most times, it's bare earth. And his first work was to try to go through the last decade and identify bare earth pixels so we could try to see at least the carbon signature that's reflected. So they had sifted through all these naughty green pixels that were covering up the earth. We really wanted to see the carbon. And I said, actually, that's part of the signal. We want to see the plants that are putting carbon into the soil and the dynamic change of those plants. And so he went back recently for us, went through this time series, just the last 2 years. They have 100 time points. And for every pixel now, what you're showing is the dynamic change in vegetation cover for those points. And then makes these really rich pixels. This is monitoring, not management. This is just what's happened. But you can see how these creek lines are greening up when the droughts shift to flood. Now, if we recolor that, these are the vegetation pixels that have changed. And inside this landscape are these experiments in rehydration. So this is not just the observation of what nature is doing when the intense rains come and break the droughts, but what's happening on farms. And let's zoom down now into these rehydration controls so you can see from space the results of landscape regeneration at scale, and they can continue. This is little stripes of ponds. This is 10-meter pixels, so we're getting a higher resolution. If you go into Google Earth and you zoom around, you can sort of get different time points, and you can see those ponds. And Kirsty went out and flew her drone to capture the revegetation change. Obviously, if they don't do this ponding, the water just runs right off. But if they do, they catch that, they reduce that evaporation, it goes to transpiration through plants and soils, and you've got vegetation in the desert for animals. Here's a closer look. So it's really wonderful, I think, this is just last week actually, to connect the satellite monitoring with real results on the ground. And there's no reason that we can't just keep scaling this up in my mind. So I think I'll leave you with that. It's a huge team working out there, and I'm happy to be part of it. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justin. We have time for one question, I think. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Sarah, land manager on the Monero. We've got half bush and half love grass. We're working currently with Greening Australia to fence creek lines and put trees in and all those, we're heading down the right path. But how do I, as a land manager, get in touch with people like you who have these knowledge and the farm system design tools that you're talking about? How do I spread the word within my community so that the stuff that you're doing in the labs is getting out onto our properties?
Well, we hope to come up with this toolkit of solutions. We're working with Upper Snowy Land Care. If Margaret McKinnon's here, that's one of our close partners. So get in touch. The Civilize AI tool, if you go there, that's already active now for all of New South Wales. If you found your farm and you draw a box over it, then it'll automatically, calculate the creek lines, ridge lines, and come up with some suggested places for you to put your fence lines. And you can adjust the density of that and sort of do it in stages if you want. Measuring the carbon, I think it's a bit early now. We're trying to work with some of the bigger labs to kind of get the tools over. The models, we have the first generation of models. So it's a work in progress. I'm glad that you're out ahead of it. And we'd like to know what you're doing where and when so that we can come and try to help you quantify it. It takes a few years for the trees to kind of get out of the grass, but the last few years have been fantastic. So don't wait for science. Don't wait for perfection. Most of these regen farmers are way ahead of us. And I'm just trying to chase along and quantify the good work and validate so that we can make these specific recommendations.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for the question. Anybody?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Justin. You just encapsulated what I was about to say. Most of the people in this room are way in front of the measurement, and that doesn't matter. That is a good thing because you're the leaders that I was alluding to before. But if people like Justin continue to monitor that and measure it and quantify it, then there is an opportunity to make money. But in the meantime, let's just fix the planet first, huh?